1 year ago, BP's deepwater drilling disaster began, tragically killing 11 workers and ultimately causing the largest oil release in U.S. history, over 15 times the size of the Exxon Valdez spill. It was also the largest application of toxic dispersant in U.S. waters, with nearly 2 million gallons released, both at the surface and the seafloor of the Gulf. While clear impacts to the coast, the marine ecosystem, and the Gulf's coastal communities have been documented, after 1 year, more questions than answers remain.
We're a population who, in the last 5 years, including BP, we've had 5 mega disasters. And every one of them has created an issue where we've been told one thing and people see something else happening. Things are starting to happen that frighten people. They were terrified before of what could happen. I think now a lot of our community members are really frightened by what is happening, and they don't quite know what to do with what's happening.
Dozens of dead dolphins, many stillborn or infants, have washed up recently in the BP impact zone at over 10 times the normal rate. Researchers continue to have questions about the impact of BP's crude and corrects it on one of the most important commercial fisheries in the Gulf.
So when the oil spill had happened, many fishermen were getting their boats ready for a good season. They said that 2010 is the year that they were going to come back from the Katrina, and we're going to have a great season, visit a family, and it's a fisherman and his wife, and they have children that are going to college.
Their kids have to quit school. They have to sacrifice their education. Their parents don't even know where to turn to themselves. And for their kids to go to school would be difficult, a burden. And that's the reason why they even came to America.
Public health impacts have been at the forefront of communities' concerns about the federal government's disaster efforts, but the lack of action has many comparing the BP drilling disaster to the government's handling of the recovery and rescue efforts in post-Katrina New Orleans.
We're getting a lot of reports across the Gulf Coast region of people having major health issues. We're getting reports of respiratory issues. We're getting reports of people with rashes. We're getting reports with people with chronic coughs and a series of chronic diseases that have been exacerbated, possibly by the use of dispersants and the exposure to the oil and things related to it. It's been very difficult for us to find data about the long-term health impacts. I don't think it exists, the long-term health impacts that for exposure to dispersants. So people are in some ways treated almost like we're an experiment, this great Gulf Coast experiment.
With the recent spill underscoring the continuing ineffective response to the inevitable mistakes the oil companies impose upon the region's natural resources, more needs to be done to make the industry safer and to empower community accountability for oil corporations and their government regulators. The road to restoration will be a long haul for this beleaguered region. As the President's Gulf Coast Ecosystem Restoration Task Force develops their implementation strategy, coastal advocates who have seen numerous previous plans for the Gulf, the dead zone, and Louisiana's wetlands crisis either not implemented or be completely ineffective remain skeptical.
First of all, there has to be an acknowledgement that there hasn't been of the severity of the damage to the ecosystems and to the communities that rely on these ecosystems. Then number two, if that's done, there has to be meaningful and sustained and community-informed response or decision-making about restoring to the full extent of that impact what needs to be done. And neither of those two mandates have been met or are really well on their way to being met.
Without action by Congress to direct BP's Clean Water Act funds to the restoration of the Gulf, we will see a further degradation to the Gulf's ecosystem. However, if Congress does act and fund Gulf restoration with the $5 to $20 billion that BP will need to pay for their pollution, restoration could begin quickly and make the region's communities and natural resources resilient and sustainable.
The Gulf Coast is a wonderful, beautiful place. And it should be acknowledged for how wonderful it is and how productive it is for this country. And sadly, that's just not the case, but this disaster is not over.
We see the Gulf Coast region as America's Gulf Coast. It doesn't just belong to Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana, and the coastal states, but this is America's gem. This is America's Gulf Coast. So I am very hopeful that people will get the message, and we'll do a better job of getting the message out, and we can push and make sure that our coast is protected.
As we mark the one-year memorial of the BP drilling disaster, please help the nation learn its lessons. Support Gulf Restoration Network's efforts to fund the restoration of the Gulf with BP's Clean Water Act funds. Visit bpdrillingdisaster.org now to add your voice to the call for the cleanup of the Gulf Coast.
La terre de mon père, au revoir, la terre de mon père, au revoir, la terre de mon père.